Hey guys, it's J Babs. I do weekly paintings, and this week I'm gonna be sharing some of my painting process. I want to go through some things I think about when starting a painting like this. I'll be showing you some techniques I use, some decisions I make, especially in these early stages. I'll slow down a little bit. We can have a closer look at what informs some some of this early stage work when you're just blocking in shapes, blocking in core shadow, larger shapes, areas of contrast, things you, or at least things I typically do early in the painting. Later on, if all of this is done, it makes it really easy for me to essentially just render at that point. I'm not making decisions well into the drawing phase or painting if the skeleton, if you will, the underlying structure is in there. I know I've jumped in a little ahead here from starting completely from scratch, but I'm very much still blocking things in at this stage. One of my main goals for getting here was getting the proportions that I was satisfied with in here. Proportion is something that doesn't need to be always completely 100% accurate. Proportion is actually, as my old painting teacher used to say, proportion is what gives your painting character. Matter of fact, I remember my live painting sessions, and he would encourage us to almost leave the mistakes in the proportion as we're painting from this live model. I mean, the more I paint, especially when I'm just freely painting, the more I appreciate paintings with character and paintings that are not a mere copy of the reference. The reference is really just there for exactly what it is, reference. Not so much to be treated as, your underlying layout to essentially trace, because that's why we have photography. I mean, there's a place for hyper realism, for sure. But especially when you're just trying to evoke a mood, like I'm doing here, especially with the color and the tones I'm using, the values in my hues. It's a very moody painting, and in this early stage I'm also very much trying to establish that mood, and that mood keeps me energized throughout the rest of the painting when this loose part is done and I'm rendering. But I've really come to appreciate the little quirks that might be left through imperfections. Use of alternative colors that are not completely representative of what you see in nature, or even what you see in your reference. I like to use reference just as a touching point, just to check if things aren't completely off. Unless I'm doing a serious caricature, just to check. Sometimes I might even use light and reference, and I'm painting a figure, but my reference has no figure in it. It's really just to see how how it's working, how the mood is being evoked in whichever reference I'm looking at, and I bring that over into the painting. And sometimes I use reference purely to see the shapes or a specific mechanic in 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 the emotion, or in the lighting, or in the scenery, how things behave when they're in motion. And my goal then is just to try and capture the essence of these moments, and create a piece where an art piece that's has a voice of its own. It's speaking to you, it's saying something. But without getting too deep into that, I essentially just like to express myself in the painting, and express a specific emotion or mood or atmosphere. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm just trying to establish that mood, the atmosphere, and hopefully in the end keep the energy that I have in these first few stages. Energy is really important for me at the end of the painting. That's why I've always loved a blend of realism in some places, exaggeration in others, high contrast in places, really just trying to draw a focus and tell a story within the frame, whether that's whether it's a static art piece or it's motion. Painting is very soothing. Now that that first part is established, the shadows, the shapes, the main mood, the expression, now that those things are established, I'll start to go in and really define some of my lightest lights, some of my darkest darks, and which areas I want to start pulling focus. Pulling focus is another reason why I love having the artistic freedom to alter a reference, or to create something that is completely new. In life drawing, you can have a whole room. They can be painting from a still life composition, a model, a theme. It could be highly themed. It could be themed to the point where you have a model in a specific time era with props from that specific time era, but at the end of it, you look at everyone's canvas and it's completely different. Everyone is telling a different story. And that's what I love about painting. That's why it's so soothing. Because the whole time when you're in that painting, you're in that world that you're creating. You're in tune with the character that you're developing. Even if you don't necessarily embody that character. I mean, in this case, I'm not Catwoman, but I'm very I'm very in tune to what she represents in this little world that I'm creating. Here I'm establishing the darkest darks. I find establishing the darkest darks in the eyes early on fairly fairly good for me, because as the painting goes on, it's really easy to get caught up in the rendering. And that's where curating your core shadows and your core highlights becomes important. Because if you know that early on, you can establish your darkest darks and your lightest lights. And it's especially with the eyes. The eyes have a tendency to start off dark in relation to the rest of the painting, but as you start to establish more defined color, in this case my lightest lights are a lot more defined than earlier, and if I had not indicated the darkness of things like her eyes, they might start to recede as the painting goes on, and I might start to lose that contrast in the eyes. And a lot of the expression is in the eye of someone. So that's what I'm doing here, and continuing to try and keep my core shapes, which I established earlier, and keep some continuity in the mood. So I've jumped ahead a little bit here, but I essentially just rendered a bit more and wanted to skip some of the redundancy, since I was just defining a bit more shapes. But this is a time where I start to really just get into the zone. The decisions I make around some of my core shadows and my core lights start to come into play. I have to be careful not to lose those areas, otherwise I'm in danger of losing the energy I initially started. Keeping energy for me in a painting is key, but and enjoyable, but at the same time it's hard, because you can get lost in making things look buttery smooth, if you will. And the energy just starts to get sucked out of the drawing or the painting. All of those nice loose lines that initially got you excited now start to feel like they're out of place, because you've pulled focus too much in specific areas, or even universally, that you've lost interest in completing the artwork. That's something I try as much as possible to avoid. A good way I do this is by not focusing too much in one area. And this is another thing I got from live painting. In order to make sure you have a complete painting or story, you need to be working around the canvas. So you're spending attention, you're giving attention to the face or the hands or the feet. And in live painting, unless intentional, if there's time, you know, really anything past a 5-minute painting, there should be an indication of hands and feet. The at their most basic forms, because then you end up with areas of focus, and when they're incomplete, they your story seems incomplete. When we look at people, we often we'll look at their eyes, we'll scan for their feet and their hands in paintings. This is generally what happens. And when people are looking at your painting, your canvas, the story you're telling, their eyes will be drawn to your character's eyes, if it has one. It will be drawn to what are the hands and feet doing. These things convey emotion. And when they're incomplete, again, unless intentional, through the style of the painting, it can make a story feel incomplete. So here I've established my first layer of lights and darks, and I've established some key contrast areas. In this case, it's right there in her eyes, that emotion, the expression that I'm trying to convey, and trying to keep focus there as I continue this painting. So I was actually initially going to cut this section out, because what I did there was I brought the painting off the surface I'm working on. In this case, it's flat, and what can happen is distortion can start to set in. When you have the painting completely flat, your canvas is receding away from you. Therefore, having a skewed perspective can lead to skewed proportions, similar to using different camera lenses that, a 25 will look different than a 50, than a zoomed in 60, things like that. The proportion will start to it'll be much more clearer if you look at it face on, rather than leaving the painting on your surface the entire time. In live painting, I would often stand back and just have a look. Sometimes I'd even go for a walk. I still do that now with digital painting. I'll go for a walk just to have some fresh eyes when I come back to the piece. Change locations, things like that give you a fresh perspective. At least it gives me a fresh perspective. I can talk about some of those things I do to keep a fresh eye in another video. But it's good to, like any work that you're doing, it's good to walk away from, if it's a screen or something that requires a lot of focus, just to step away, refresh your mind, your eyes, and come back. Sometimes things jump out right away, and you're like, whoa, what was I doing there? That can happen, especially with the later stage of your painting, where you walk away and you've been rendering something for maybe 5 minutes, and you come back and you're like, I cannot believe I just spent 5 minutes rendering this angle when it's completely off. But that's all part of the joy of painting. It's just you enter a different world. Like I said, for me, I get absorbed into the world of this painting. Things that could be going on around this character, things that could be going on in the scene right now. Here I'm defining some of those areas that our eyes naturally go to, so the main features of the face. I'm trying to be careful here not to get too detailed in the rendering, because I want to keep it fairly loose, since other areas of my painting will be loose. And here I just flip the canvas because I'm trying to get a fresh perspective, because I'm not in a painting lab right now where I can walk around, change angles, stand really far back. I mean, I can stand really far back. Changing the reflection of your canvas really helps to realize things that may not be so apparent when you've been looking at the same angle for an hour per se. And that's why flipping the canvas really helps. I noticed some things here, especially in the lips, and I wasn't quite happy with the shape, so just doing some adjustments here. And this is really why I paint in this fashion, where there are many styles of painting, and for me, if I think back to traditional, I really loved acrylic when doing long painting sessions like this. Acrylic allowed you to paint on top of something that you may have established early on, but later on you can change it within, while the energy is still there, it's still fresh. You don't have to wait days for it to dry before you go over with a second coat. And it's not drying so quick that you feel, you know you can't make any changes. For example, I also love painting with watercolors. And with watercolors, it's a totally different type of mindset and energy that I have. I I embrace the fact that I likely won't be going over anything in watercolors. I embrace that the colors will mix in unique ways almost every time. The best I can do in the case of watercolors is paint as often as possible to learn those patterns where the colors will blend with how much water I'm having in my paintbrush, and how much pigment is on my brush, how much pre-watering I'm doing on the canvas. Just learning how these mixing patterns interact so that I can be more confident every time I'm painting watercolors. It's a very different feeling when painting watercolors, and it's maybe not my favorite. Actually, it is my favorite. That is my favorite medium. Um, but I compare digital painting a lot to acrylic because for me that's what it feels like. It's the perfect timing for making changes within the painting, making changes 15 minutes after you've taken a break, blending within the time frame that you're painting a section, and being able to go over it and correct within your session. There are other painting methods in digital painting where you might put a flat coat down first and start bringing in core shadow and core lightness slowly with really soft brushes and airbrushes, and it gives you a very smooth result. And that's also another avenue. A lot of people paint like that, and depending on the type of painting I'm doing, I may also opt to do that. Maybe I'll show that in another video. By the way, you guys let me know how you're finding this so far, what your process what your process is like, things you would do different, your favorite mediums, how it relates to your digital paintings and drawings, and even maybe, traditional animation versus digital animation. It's different for everyone, and that's why I'm sharing mine, and really just to have the end of sharing, any specific um, not for any specific teaching, because there's so many different methods out there, and everyone has their own thing. Industry, I find, also really defines style, because when you need to be completing things in a certain amount of time, if you're working frame by frame, especially if you're being paid frame by frame, your style is just totally different, and that can affect paintings you do. You might be a lot quicker with decisions you make in paintings. Um, you know, an oil painter has a totally different painting style than, someone who's animating backgrounds or painting backgrounds for animations. At some point, volume will start to dictate the style of your work. Here I'm just adding her famous goggles here. Very iconic for Catwoman. I'm trying to capture the the essence of those goggles. Here it's on her forehead. She's not wearing them because I was trying to say something with the facial expression, but I didn't want to lose sight of those goggles because they're very iconic. Even more so than I would say her ears, because the ears can vary a lot. Some artists like to draw them thin. Some artists like to draw them realistic. I've just indicated them with more of an impression here rather than going into what they actually look like, because I'm pulling focus to her expression, and her goggles for me are more important than her cat ears in this case. In other characters, like let's say Batman, his um his ears can really start to take character. I've seen artists really express, you know, their version of Batman in those ears, and it can be really fun to draw or paint. I used to read a lot of comics. I don't read as much because of work, but when I did, I used to love seeing the different areas that artists are expressing their version of the character, the world that they are in. I can almost feel their their painting strokes or drawing strokes in the way that they've established an iconic feature, like, the Batman ears. Dave Finch, one of my favorite artists in general, the way he would express, it's almost like I'm there and I can feel his brush strokes or his pen strokes as he's making them. My hand can follow the lines and I can feel the energy of the painting, or in his case, the frame by frame drawing that he would make, or in his case, the drawing. So I'm coming to the ending of my rendering here, and I'm now thinking about areas of focus that I want to push and pull. I never really like to completely render a drawing. Like I mentioned in the beginning, I'm trying to be very expressive with contours I might leave, or areas of shadow I might leave, and anywhere I'm pulling focus. So that way my detail is adding to that story that I'm trying to tell. Sometimes adding a lot of detail everywhere can, you lose focus because everything looks equally as important. Ironically, I take this, actually not so ironic, but this is a concept that follows me into design also, when I'm designing products or interaction or motion graphics, or you want to keep the busiest areas for where the focus is. And in design, let's say graphic design, the area of focus is in that place where you need the most messaging, or you're trying to convey the most important part of your message. In product design, you want the areas of focus to be what the user needs to be doing. For example, if you in product design, I usually use this analogy where if you're in a house and you want to be warm, you're going to want to turn off or turn on your thermostat. So you want to adjust it so that your house eventually starts becoming warm. So if a house was an interface, as a designer, knowing the main behavior, or one of the main behaviors of being inside is being warm, you would want to draw attention to where that thermostat is. If this was, just using an analogy, if this was the sole purpose of, being in the house, there's other things, of course, but that thermostat, that UI piece, that's where you want to draw focus inside of that interface. Another analogy, if you're watching a movie, I this this one I see a lot, and it takes me out of the movie because I know what they're trying to do at that point. But when you watch a movie, I won't mention any specific movies, and you see someone or something happening in such a busy area of the environment, and there's a lot of chaos happening. Maybe it's a chase scene, but what's actually happening in that scene has very little to do with the story. It's just overlaid with chaos. You know, things exploding, maybe, running through a market, pushing things over, CGI everywhere, but it really has no major impact to the overall story. And because they've now pulled your focus so much in this one area, you you're kind of they've already set a really high bar for the other areas of impact. So when those other areas of impact come, sometimes it can fall short, and other times it can just be confusing because your energy has been it's been pulled so much so early that you don't have energy for to focus on the main story points anymore. But I think you guys get what I'm trying to say. I ended up going off on a tangent that started talking about houses and thermostats. That's hilarious. Um, but back to this painting. I'm now, like I said, just trying to find areas to pull focus and while keeping it interesting, keeping some of the energy. A way that I also do that is through the texture of the brush that I'm using, which is why I don't often start off with bringing in core shadows and core lights with airbrushes. I like to get solid shapes down so that the the painting can retain energy as I start pulling and pushing things. It's almost like sculpting. I'm not so much at this stage. I'm not so much trying to define lights and shadows anymore. By doing it very early in the stage, I can just focus on accentuating a few things. In this case, the eyelashes, the reflection in the eyes, little details that are subtle but add to the emotion. If something is wrong, is off with the eyes, it's you'll usually feel it, and you'll it's an uncanny place where you know something's wrong. Your brain's telling you something's wrong, but you can't quite pinpoint it because we, as much as we make eye contact all day while talking, most of us are not staring in people's eyes trying to figure out what makes them look like eyes, unless you're having a focus session about them. And sometimes even when you are having focus sessions, you could have had a few focus sessions and still miss some details that make eyes look like eyes. It's things that only become apparent when you're painting them over time. Details start opening up. As you get to one level of detail, you realize, oh, there's another level of detail. And that's how you can start to choose like balance. At least that's where I start to choose my balance, where how far I want to take the realism of the eyes. I very much still want to keep it an energetic painting, a painterly painting, if you will. Here I'm going back to some of the hands, trying to bringing in detail in her her suit, fading that out as it goes down the canvas. There's a conscious decision here to keep focus away from her suit, which when you've seen her in the comics or the movies, it's usually a leather tight suit and it's very shiny. But in this case it's not. It wouldn't serve the purpose of the story. So I've left out most of that contrast that you would find in her suit. Now I'm just going through some final touches, bringing it to finished detail, and also just experimenting, having some fun. Sometimes at the end of the painting, I'll just start using random brushes to see what happens. Maybe it's cold, maybe it's snowing. I live in Canada. It was still snowing in May a few weeks ago, so maybe it's snowing. Maybe it's not snowing. Maybe she's in a busy city, which she most likely is, and there's lights all in the background, and maybe it's a busy city that's snowing. This is literally what is going on in my head as I'm doing these last few stages here, and I'm trying to have fun, trying to keep it light, energetic, painterly. I love doing painterly things. Anytime I look at a painterly painting, I can immediately get into the expression of what the artist is trying to do, especially with charcoal work. When I look at charcoal work, it's there's a lot of character that comes through from different artists, and I absolutely love looking at charcoal life drawings. It doesn't matter whether they're 1 minute sessions, 5 minute sessions, or more sustained drawings or illustrations. The energy is something I can immediately get into. It feels like I was there with them as they're making these strokes with the side of the charcoal. What type of charcoal were they using? I think about these things. It's oddly soothing. Here I'm trying to see if if it's cold, if she's breathing out cold air. Just kind of, I haven't downloaded any custom brushes, and I'm trying not to do that with the iPad, so I can keep it as vanilla as possible and see how far I can push the vanilla brush tools of Procreate. Flip the canvas again just to check my proportions, see if anything jumps out at me. Flipping a canvas is almost a cheat in the digital space. You can do it with a mirror in real life, but it's the equivalent of walking away for like 15 minutes and coming back. And sometimes using a mirror helps in real life too, but a lot will become apparent by walking away for 15 minutes. And switching your canvas digitally does that for you. It reorients your perspective, and you look at it with fresh eyes. The shapes, for example, if you spend 5 minutes rendering a nose, when you flip the canvas, it becomes a brand new shape. Not the nose that you think you were looking at. It becomes the nose in a different shape, an unbiased shape, free from the vision that you're trying to apply to it. And then fixing it in that reflected state means you're more likely to end up with an accurate, when I say accurate, it could be distortion heavy too, but your intended outcome for what that nose really should be. I'm adding a little bit of detail here to her zip. Another another characteristic thing for Catwoman, because in this case I'm not going crazy on the reflection of her leather and the contrast that usually comes with that. So I'm trying to bring back the character of the suit through the zipper and just add in a little detail to it. And there we have it. I'm pretty happy with this. At least I thought it was after looking at it for a bit. I was at the stage and I was like, okay, you know what? Maybe this is too busy. Maybe she's not in a city with a bunch of snow and lights and this stuff happening. I start to notice that her face is receding, and maybe I need to pull some things out so that it doesn't get lost in the sea of accents of snow and light in the background. So I start pulling out some reflections here just to bring a bit of depth to her skin. While I had my major lights and shadows, I didn't quite have, you know, the glare of skin. And in this case, it doesn't so much detract from the story I'm telling, because I'm really trying to draw you into her eyes. These, you know, it's almost like she's trying to lure you to do something, you know. And this way, introducing those reflections in her skin tone is adding to that, not taking away. If I was, you know, if I was painting, you know, a very moody, different type of moody painting where it's super depressing and gloomy, and you know, maybe adding skin tone highlights and, you know, light reflections wouldn't be the greatest thing. But in this case, it's okay for what I'm trying to do anyways. And it helps me solve two things. One, to push her face and her expression forward after introducing other elements, and two, inherently add into the expression that she already has, in that, you know, glamorous, slightly seductive, slightly proud emotion that she has. I almost left it like this. I was like, what am I doing here? I'm just playing with brushes, but that's all. That's where the fun is. Just try things. I mean, unless you have a specific, you know, problem to solve through a brief, and you're just painting, just have fun with it. Here I'm adding some blood because I'm like, why not? Like, maybe she just fatalityed another somebody else and pulled out their heart or something. I don't know. But I eventually removed the blood, and you know, go back to just almost the lazy gesture that she has. I'm still deciding what to do with those lights in the background. If, you know, if it's too much, if it's pulling or pushing too much focus. And yeah, I'm looking at it, and I'm just trying to see if the story I wanted to get is coming through while I adjust my pencil. I promise that's what I know. That it seems like I'm just trying to get symmetry here, even though it looks bad, but bad symmetry framing. But that these are the things that are going through my head at the moment, or in the moment as this is happening. And yeah, that is where I left things off. And Thanks for watching the video, guys. Let me know what you think, your methods of doing things you think about while you're painting. If you enjoyed the video, drop me a like. I'll be painting every week over the next 100 weeks. If you want to join the journey, hit that subscribe button and I'll see you next week.